In April of 1901, during the renovation of an abandoned funeral home on Magazine Street, New Orleans, workers broke through a bricked-up cellar wall and found a small chamber lined with rusted iron restraints. Inside, there were fragments of human nails etched against oak coffins, and a ledger bound in black leather, dated 1849 to 1856. The ledger bore the name Mr. Alphonse Duval, proprietor of the Duval Sons House of Rest. Within its pages were 56 names, men, women and children, each marked with a notation, extended viewing, paid in full. City authorities sealed the records within a week, citing public sensitivity. No official inquiry was ever announced. By 1910, the building was condemned and its contents quietly destroyed, but fragments survived, whispered among descendants of the city's oldest families. What the workers uncovered beneath the Duval house suggested something far darker than grave robbery or malpractice, because according to that ledger, the bodies recorded there had never truly been dead. What authorities found next would haunt New Orleans for generations. Before we continue with the story of Alphonse Duval and his horrific plan, hit subscribe and ring the bell to join our archive of forgotten histories. Comment below and tell us what state you're listening from. Now, let's step back to New Orleans, 1850, when the Mourning House first opened its doors. In the spring of 1850, New Orleans was a city suspended between splendor and decay. The Mississippi carried both fortune and fever, and the air itself seemed to waver between perfume and rot. The city's grand balconies leaned over streets thick with mud, and every dawn brought the tolling of funeral bells for another soul taken by the heat or the plague. Death was ordinary here. People had grown accustomed to it, even tried to make it beautiful. The parlors were draped in black crepe, and mourning was its own kind of theatre. It was in this fragile place, where death and decorum intertwined, that a quiet man named Alphonse Duval began his work. His funeral home stood on Magazine Street, 3 blocks above the riverfront, behind a row of wrought iron railings and shuttered windows. The building, 2 stories of pale brick, had been constructed only a few years before, in the high style of Greek Revival architecture. The first floor opened to 3 rooms used for public viewings, long, echoing chambers where mirrors multiplied the faces of the dead, and lamplight softened their pallor to something almost gentle. Above, behind locked doors, Duval kept his private laboratory and the cold room, a chamber with no windows and an unnatural chill even in the height of summer. Alphonse Duval was not born to wealth. He was the son of Etienne Duval, a French apothecary who had once served in Napoleon's army and came to Louisiana after the fall of the empire. The elder Duval brought with him chemical texts, brass instruments, and an obsession with preserving life beyond its natural limits. His son inherited all of it, his father's notebooks, his fascination, and his moral blindness. By the time Alphonse was 30, he had already made a name for himself among physicians for his precision and his silence. He was always courteous, always in black gloves, his manner grave but reassuring. Clients trusted him with their loved ones. The city's doctors trusted him with their cadavers. When the House of Rest opened in October of 1849, the newspapers hailed it as progress. Families could now pay for their dead to be kept intact for 12, 24, or even 48 hours before burial. The process, Duval promised, would preserve the body as though asleep, the likeness of life maintained through science. Prices began at $3 for the poor and climbed to $15 for the wealthy. He became a fashionable necessity in a city that lived in daily conversation with death. In his earliest advertisements, Duval used a phrase that would later return to haunt him: artificial repose. He claimed that his methods could grant the dead the serenity denied them in life. Behind those words was a secret pursuit that few would have believed. He sought not merely to preserve, but to pause the body, to hold it somewhere between life and death. He believed that death was not a single moment, but a process, and that science might delay the soul's departure. What began as a theory turned quickly into experimentation. Duval had inherited his father's knowledge of tropical venoms, and through merchants arriving from the Caribbean he acquired small quantities of a paralytic substance known as curare. He discovered that in minute doses it could still the muscles without extinguishing breath or thought. The victim remained conscious, unable to move, unable even to blink. To the observer, they appeared serene. To the victim, it was unending terror. In one letter later found in the bricked-up vault, written in Duval's immaculate script, he described a subject who had entered complete stillness within 11 minutes, heartbeat steady, gaze untroubled. In another, he reflected, "To give peace while consciousness endures, this is the highest mercy science can offer." He never called them victims, always subjects, patients, or clients. Duval employed 2 apprentices over the years. The first, a young man named Joseph Lebreton, left abruptly in 1851 after what Duval described as a chemical accident. The second was 19-year-old Elias Turner, an orphan eager for a respectable trade. Turner was bright, dutiful, and easily awed by his employer's precision. In letters to his cousin in Baton Rouge, he spoke of the most advanced methods of preservation, though he also confessed unease about the sealed cabinets labeled "nerve tonics, do not disturb." Duval forbade him from entering the cold room at night. Elias obeyed, but the sound of faint gasps, of glass clinking softly, haunted his sleep. Duval's standing in the community continued to rise. He was invited to speak before the Louisiana Undertakers Association, where he announced that a day will come when death itself may be postponed. The audience applauded. None knew how literally he meant it. To the people of New Orleans, Duval represented dignity in an age of chaos. To the physicians who supplied him with compounds, he was a useful colleague. To the bereaved, he was comfort incarnate. In truth, his innovations fed upon a city that was already half resigned to horror. Epidemics blurred the boundary between sickness and death. Victims of fever fell into comas so deep they were often buried alive. Newspapers printed stories of coffins unearthed with scratch marks inside the lids. People began to fear being buried too soon. Duval promised the opposite, assurance that death would be peaceful, controlled, beautiful, and so they trusted him. From 1850 to 1856, official burial records list 56 funerals under his care. The causes of death are recorded in neat, confident script: sudden seizure, unknown fever, heat paralysis. Yet the burial certificates often went unsigned, and several coffins were reportedly reopened after interment at the family's request. In one account, a widow insisted her husband's eyes be closed again, though Duval's own record stated they already had been. Years later, fragments of Duval's private journal were found hidden in the same ledger. The entries are clinical, almost detached. Stage 1, full paralysis achieved within 11 minutes. Stage 2, reflexive tremor persists. Stage 3, verbal murmur detected at 47th hour, ceased at dawn. One notation bears the initials EL, Elias Turner, but that would come later. In the early 1850s, all New Orleans saw was a man who could turn grief into ceremony. The city's wealthiest families, Beauregard, Fontenot, Lacroix, brought their dead to him. His services became a mark of refinement. He dined with judges and physicians. He supplied Charity Hospital with embalming solutions. Among his associates was Dr. Lucien Marigny, a physician famed for his work on tropical fevers. Surviving correspondence between the two men reveals discussions of dosage experiments and responses of the respiratory nerve. One half-burned note reads, "The subject ceased to blink yet maintains pulse. The mother, watching, believed him only in deep sleep. Payment received in full." No scandal followed these words in their time. The public saw a devoted undertaker offering solace to the grieving. Only in hindsight do the patterns emerge: the missing apprentices, the silence around certain burials, the bricked stairway to the cold room. By 1855, the extended viewing, what Duval called the Vigil of 2 nights, had become his signature offering. He charged $25 for it, a sum beyond the reach of most, yet families paid without question. Some whispered that the bodies at the Duval house seemed almost to breathe, that tears sometimes lingered unnaturally on their cheeks. Servants claimed to have heard soft sounds from the coffins after midnight, faint as sighs. But grief makes imagination a dangerous thing, and no one wished to believe in such cruelty. And so the city kept its silence. Duval's carriages continued to roll through the iron gates of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the mourners trailing behind, unaware that some of the figures inside those polished caskets might still be aware of their own descent into the earth. Even now, reading the surviving fragments, the receipts, the ledger pages, the dry newspaper notices, one can feel the unease beneath the polite language. Every line hides a tremor of fear, a hesitation too delicate to name. Alphonse Duval was no mere criminal. He was a man of method, of faith twisted into justification. He believed that suffering was sanctified if it was hidden beneath ceremony. He believed that death could be improved upon. He was wrong. And thus began the quiet reign of the Mourning House, a place where the dead were not dead, and the living dared not ask too many questions. By the autumn of 1855, the Mourning House had become part of the fabric of New Orleans. Its name appeared in obituary columns with the same routine dignity as any church or chapel. When a citizen died, the family's first question was not where to bury, but whether Duval could prepare the body in time for viewing. He was, by every measure, indispensable. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, the foundations had begun to tremble. The signs came first to the youngest pair of eyes in that house, the apprentice, Elias Turner. Elias had come to the city 2 years earlier from Plaquemine Parish. He was the son of a riverboat carpenter who'd succumbed to cholera, leaving the boy with neither family nor trade. Duval took him in under the pretext of charity, promising to teach him a profession that would never want for business. Elias was 19, quick with his hands, and too innocent to imagine cruelty beneath refinement. At first he was proud to serve. He polished the carriages, prepared linen, carried flowers. He learned the language of mourning, the ritual of presentation, the way to fold a veil, to light gas lamps so they softened the pallor of skin. Duval was precise in all things. He instructed Elias to treat the dead as guests in temporary repose. But over time the boy began to notice small incongruities that gnawed at his peace. Once during the preparation of a young woman said to have perished from fever, Elias saw Duval draw a syringe not of the standard embalming solution, but of a pale green liquid. The Undertaker inserted the needle not into a vein but near the base of the skull, and then waited, watching the woman's face intently. After a minute her eyelids flickered. Duval placed a finger over her lips and whispered, "Hush now, dear, soon you'll be still." Then he looked at Elias and said calmly, "You see how the muscles resist peace? The body must be he taught to rest." That night, Elias could not sleep. He told himself it was a reflex, a trick of nerves. The next morning the woman lay in the parlor, her complexion soft and lifelike, her mouth slightly parted as though she might still draw breath. The mourners praised Duval for his gentleness. Weeks later, a similar event occurred. A child of 7, son of a merchant from Chartres Street, was brought in after a sudden faint. Duval dismissed Elias to the upper hall while he worked. Yet through the floorboards the boy heard faint tapping, irregular and weak, like fingernails against wood. It lasted nearly an hour. When Duval called him down, the child's hands had been folded beneath lace. Duval's expression was serene. "You mustn't listen for what belongs to God," he said. Elias began keeping small notes of what he saw, dates, initials, odd instructions written in Duval's hand. He found invoices for chemicals shipped under false names, extract of curare, tetrodotoxin, syrup of aconite. He copied one of the labels onto a scrap of paper and kept it hidden behind a loose floorboard beneath his bed. In his letters to his cousin he hinted at troubling practices, but confessed that no one would believe him. "He works with poisons that do not kill," Elias wrote. "They quiet the body but leave the eyes aware. He calls it mercy, I call it torment." The unease grew when Duval began speaking more freely of his philosophy. Over brandy late one evening, he told Elias that true compassion required distance from emotion. "When you love the living," he said, "you cause pain. When you love the soul, you must deny its suffering. My clients thank me because I grant their dead a few hours of grace. They never see the struggle, they see only peace. That is the difference between art and horror, Elias, the observer's ignorance." The boy said nothing, but his silence began to betray him. Duval, ever perceptive, sensed the hesitation and turned watchful. He forbade Elias from entering the cellar. He kept the key to the cabinet of tonics in his pocket, even as he slept. In February of 1856, Elias discovered what should have remained hidden. A family from St. Charles Parish had brought the body of their daughter, barely 16. She was to be displayed for 2 days, as custom dictated. The first night passed uneventfully. On the second, while Duval attended supper with a doctor and left Elias to tend the lamps, the boy heard a faint sound from behind the viewing room curtain. A sigh, soft, unmistakable. He stepped closer. The girl's lips trembled, and a bead of moisture appeared at the corner of her mouth. Elias, terrified yet resolute, leaned nearer and whispered her name as written on the tag, Marguerite. Her eyelids shivered. The faintest movement of breath touched his hand. He fled to the street, unable to endure it. He went first to the rectory of St. Alphonsus Church, begging the priest to come. The priest, Father Morel, knew Duval and dismissed the boy's story as visions born of grief and fumes. He advised rest and prayer. When Elias persisted, the priest promised to inquire privately. That inquiry never came. The next morning, Father Morel visited Duval himself, perhaps mentioning the boy's agitation. What passed between them remains unknown, but that evening Duval summoned Elias with unnatural calm. He told him he had erred through overwork, that he would rest the next day, and that he should drink a tonic to steady the nerves. Elias, frightened yet trusting, obeyed. The following morning he awoke unable to rise. His limbs were heavy, his tongue thick. By noon he could no longer move at all. Duval found him in bed and declared he was suffering from swamp fever. He summoned Dr. Mourning, who examined the boy and pronounced it a sudden seizure of the nerves. The physician prescribed rest and warm compresses, noting in his diary later that the patient's eyes seemed uncommonly alert, though speech impossible. For 3 days Elias lay trapped within his own body, aware but voiceless. The maid assigned to tend him later told her sister that his gaze followed her with pleading intensity, though he could make no sound. On the 4th day, Duval sat beside him with his ledger open. "You wish to understand," he whispered. "Now you do. This is the passage between worlds, stillness before release. You see, I do not harm, I preserve." Then he administered a final injection, and Elias's eyes fixed in glassy calm. His death certificate read simply, apoplexy. He was buried within the week, his coffin sealed in the very parlor where he had once stood beside others. Neighbors remarked on Duval's visible grief. He closed the house for 2 days and wore a black armband. None questioned his sincerity. But not everyone was fooled. The laundress, a Creole woman named Aimee, confided to her husband that she had found bloodied rags hidden in the cellar furnace the morning after the boy's death. She also mentioned seeing Duval carry a small leather-bound book from the upper floor late that night, muttering in French. The husband warned her to stay silent. The Duval family was powerful, and rumors against them had ruined people before. The ledger from that week shows a final entry in Duval's hand. EL, paralysis complete, respiration gentle, subject ceased at dawn, transition serene. Below that, a mark, extended viewing, no charge. When the body was displayed, Duval insisted upon a closed coffin. He told mourners that the heat had discolored the skin. Those who approached said they thought they heard a faint ticking from within, like nails against wood, though perhaps it was only the settling of the coffin lid. Within a month, business at the Mourning house resumed. Another epidemic had begun along the river, and families again sought his services. Duval's reputation, if anything, was strengthened by his apparent devotion to his lost apprentice. He worked long hours, speaking little. To the world, he was the picture of solemn piety. Years later, in 1901, when the bricked chamber beneath that building was opened, the coroner's notes described finding narrow grooves cut into the interior of the coffins, grooves made by human fingernails. But in 1856, no one suspected. The truth lay sealed with Elias Turner. One surviving letter from Father Morell, discovered decades later in an archive of the Archdiocese, mentions the matter obliquely. I fear that Mr. Duval's young assistant fell victim to some experiment of preservation not wholly sanctioned by heaven. The man himself shows no contrition, believing his act a work of science. I have chosen silence, for the city is weary of death, and to speak might cause scandal where comfort is most needed. Thus the circle closed. The witness had been silenced, the church complicit through indifference, and the name of Duval remained unblemished. But something had changed within him. From that year onward, his correspondence grew sparse and his tone cold. Clients noted his distant gaze, his reluctance to speak of the afterlife. He became mechanical in his rituals, driven more by precision than by pity. Later that same year, another assistant was hired briefly, a man named Rousseau, who left after 2 months, refusing to explain why. He told acquaintances only that the walls of the cellar moved at night, and that he would never again work where the dead were made to wait before burial. The ledger's last entries from 1856 record 3 consecutive extended viewings marked with identical notes. Serenity maintained, slight tremor after 47 hours. None bear signatures from attending physicians. After that, the pages are blank. It is believed Duval ceased writing altogether when the Civil War approached, and his clientele fled or died. The final contemporary reference to Elias Turner appears in a small notice in the Picayune dated March 2, 1856. Mr. A. Duval, proprietor of the House of Rest, regrets to announce the passing of his devoted assistant after brief illness. Interment private. No one questioned it. In historical hindsight, Elias's death stands as the first known evidence that Duval's artificial repose was not simply embalming, but deliberate paralysis, the conscious trapping of a living soul within its own body. It would take half a century for proof to emerge, when the sealed room beneath the Mourning house was finally uncovered, but even now the ledger tells a story too consistent to dismiss. Elias Turner was the witness who almost revealed the truth. His punishment was to endure it. By the spring of 1857, Armand Duval had refined his method to something he called the system. It was no longer about a single experiment or a private curiosity. It was a procedure timed and measured like the workings of a clock. Those who came to him brought their dead, and he delivered stillness so perfect that no breath, no twitch betrayed the truth beneath the skin. The city did not question him. New Orleans was too familiar with plague and heat to doubt death when it came quickly. Duval merely gave the inevitable a gentler face. He spoke of temporal suspension, claiming the technique allowed families to behold their loved ones as they were, not as corruption would have them. The phrase spread from mouth to mouth until it became a kind of superstition. To be prepared by Duval was to be granted beauty in parting. To be denied his service was misfortune. His system began with the draft, a mixture of aconite, belladonna, and trace amounts of curare. It halted the heart within minutes, but the mind lingered for hours, aware, paralyzed, imprisoned. Then came the injection at the base of the skull, which he said quieted the will. When all motion ceased, he massaged the skin with a tincture of mercury and rosewater, sealing the illusion of peace. To the mourners, it was a miracle. To those who lay upon his table, it was a sentence without language. Duval no longer worked alone. He could not. Death was too plentiful, and his reputation too great. He recruited assistants from the outskirts, men desperate for coin, women who had lost husbands to the river. He trained them not in anatomy but obedience. Each was given a single task, the mixing of fluids, the polishing of glass, the lifting of bodies. None saw the entire process. None were meant to. He kept records with the same precision he once reserved for poetry. Ledger 3, recovered in fragments, shows rows of inikin, deals followed by cryptic notes. RM, respiration faint, lid flutter X3, maintained 6H12 May. JP, revival undesired, dose doubled. CL, child, no distress observed. Below each entry, the same signature, AD. Over time, those ledgers changed in tone. Where once he described bodies, he began describing subjects. He measured not the stillness but the intervals before silence. The women last longer, one line reads. Children yield quickly, men struggle in the throat. Another, the pulse speaks truth even when the tongue cannot. Rumors circulated among servants who came to collect the dead. They said the house of rest hummed at night, that faint music rose from the cellar, though no one within was living. Some claimed to have seen Duval standing by candlelight, head tilted as though listening to an unseen choir. The doctor who once supplied his tonics withdrew his patronage, citing philosophical disagreements. Yet the clients remained. Grief has always preferred faith over inquiry. In the winter of 1858, a young widow named Josephine Leroux brought her husband to Duval. He had drowned in the canal, his body recovered within hours. She demanded an open viewing. 2 nights, no expense spared. Duval agreed. On the second night she arrived early, before the candles were lit. Through the thin curtain she saw her husband's chest move once, shallow and quick, as though startled from a dream. She cried out. Duval was beside her in an instant, catching her hand, whispering, "The lungs sometimes release trapped air. It is nature's trick." He smiled, and she, trembling, forced herself to believe him. The next day she returned no more. Her servant said she burned her wedding portrait and left the city within a week. The first official complaint came that summer. A dockhand named Rousseau, the same who had once worked briefly under Duval, appeared before the municipal board claiming that the Undertaker in Camp Street keeps the dying among the dead. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Duval arrived in immaculate black, producing certificates signed by physicians attesting to every body's condition. Rousseau, unable to read or write, stammered until the room laughed him silent. The case was dismissed. Within a month he vanished, said to have boarded a riverboat bound for Baton Rouge. No record of his arrival exists. Duval's confidence deepened. He began receiving letters from Europe, medical men curious about his method of repose. He replied in fluent French, offering abstractions and philosophy but never formulae. "The difference between death and stillness," he wrote to one correspondent, "is not in the flesh, but in the consent of those who behold it. If no one calls a man living, he is dead enough for the world." That line would later appear carved into the underside of a coffin lid, the letters burned in reverse by candle flame. By 1860, the House of Rest was known simply as Duval's. It had become an institution, its name spoken with reverence. The parlor windows were draped in violet silk, the gaslights never extinguished. On humid nights, neighbors swore they heard a chorus of faint sighs through the brick walls, like air escaping from lungs. But when they told the police, the sergeant only shrugged. "The man pays his taxes, let the ghosts pay theirs." Then came the war. The city grew gaunt with hunger and fever. Corpses overflowed from churches, and Duval's services became essential once more. The army requisitioned his wagons for soldiers' bodies, and he, ever practical, accepted the contract. The ledger of 1862 lists hundreds of initials, many marked simply, "Soldier, no K, in." Beneath a cluster of them appears a single note in cramped script. "Excessive movement during transport. Tied wrists recommended." It was during those years that the tone of his writing changed entirely. The precision gave way to rapture. "They go silent too quickly now," he wrote. "The secret is lost among the noise of war. Yet in each face I glimpse the threshold, and it calls me nearer." A page later, "Perhaps the soul is only the body unwilling to obey." No record survives of his final assistance. Some say he worked alone at the end. Others claim the army sent prisoners to help, but in every account the result was the same. Duval moving among rows of shrouded figures, adjusting candles, listening for the smallest sound. Witnesses later described the smell, neither decay nor chemical, but something metallic and sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. When Union forces entered the city in 1862, Duval's building was seized for storage. He resisted, arguing that the refrigeration and equipment were essential to public health. The officer in charge noted in his log, "One Undertaker, agitated, speaks of bodies as if they still converse." He was ordered to vacate within 48 hours. That night, the neighboring block saw lights in every window of the house of rest and heard what they swore was organ music, slow, deliberate, rising toward midnight. When dawn came, the building was silent. Duval was gone. What the soldiers found when they forced entry 2 days later was recorded in the quartermaster's report. Approximately 23 bodies arranged upright along the walls, eyes open, condition remarkably preserved. Several appear to have been interred while conscious. Fingernail abrasions present on inner lids of coffins. No sign of proprietor. Papers destroyed by fire save one ledger soaked through with fluid of unknown origin. The ledger ended mid-sentence. If the soul resists sleep, then perhaps the task of the embalmer is not to soothe but to persuade. After that, Duval vanished from every registry. Some said he fled to Havana under another name. Others claimed he died in the swamps outside the city, his body mistaken for another victim of fever. Yet through the following decades, undertakers across Louisiana reported receiving unsigned packages, small vials sealed with black wax and a note reading only, "For repose." None who used them kept records for long. The House of Rest itself passed through many hands. In the 1880s it was a boarding house. By 1895 it stood empty, its windows boarded, the interior thick with dust. Children dared each other to press an ear to the door, saying they could still hear someone breathing inside. When the building was finally condemned and the cellar opened in 1901, the investigators found the chamber and its 23 subjects still upright, still intact, their eyes a faint grey film. The coroner's assistant, young at the time, wrote later that one of the figures appeared to incline forward as if to speak when the light struck its face. In every ledger that survived, one phrase repeats at the bottom margin, written like a benediction. "Peace is only the body obeying the will of another." No one ever learned whose will he meant. By the turn of the century, the House of Rest had long been abandoned. Its windows were darkened, shutters warped, and the iron gates rusted through in patches. The city around it had changed. The French Quarter's streets now rang with the clip of trolley wheels and the chatter of tourists, but within the walls of Duval's creation, time had stood still. The cypress-scented courtyard was overgrown. Weeds crowded the stone steps. Neighbors had long whispered of strange noises at night, small scratches in the earth, and shadows that seemed too deliberate. In 1901, during a renovation intended to convert the building into apartments, workmen discovered the bricked-up cellar. Behind the cold stone walls lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and chemicals. It carried a faint metallic sweetness that no laborer could identify. When they forced the last stone aside, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for life. A small, windowless room lined with restraints, narrow tables, and the remnants of jars and vials. The room was perfectly preserved, as though it had been sealed for a century. It was here that the full scale of Duval's experiments was revealed. 23 bodies were found arranged in upright positions along the walls, each one in the same unnatural repose recorded in the old ledgers. Fingernail scratches marked the inner coffins. Subtle impressions in the tables suggested attempts to lift or restrain limbs. The coroner's report, preserved in the city archives, notes, "Several subjects appear to have maintained consciousness during a prolonged paralytic state. Observers report subtle eye movement when lights are introduced." The bodies were examined with the care of both science and dread. Anthropologists and physicians agreed that the paralytic state had been chemically induced and sustained over hours, possibly days. It was the first documented instance of a controlled, conscious paralysis applied to multiple human subjects, predating modern anesthesia by decades, yet the records of the time are frustratingly incomplete. Most official reports were sealed under the pressure of prominent family requests, and only fragments remain. Newspapers, desperate for stories of sensational discovery, published cautious reports. The Daily Picayune in April of 1901 noted, "Workers uncover curious chamber beneath a long-abandoned building on Magazine Street. Objects of unknown purpose discovered. They avoided mention of the bodies, citing ongoing investigation. Letters between city officials indicate that the findings were quickly suppressed. One archivist's note reads, 'The Duval family requests discretion. For the good of public order, files to remain closed.'" Despite these efforts, a few determined investigators pieced together the story. Medical journals from 1923 and 1929 reference a series of posthumous observations on paralytic states and unconscious awareness, citing Duval indirectly. They describe chemical tests, patterns of bodily restraint, and early ethical questions raised by the experiments. Fragments of journals from descendants of local physicians hint that even into the 1940s, families were aware of odd accidents linked to the house of rest. Oral tradition kept pieces alive. In the quarter, stories circulated of children who disappeared for brief periods and returned pale and silent, of servants who refused to enter certain basements, and of a shadowy Undertaker who did not die as other men do. These whispers, often dismissed as folklore, became the scaffolding upon which historians would later reconstruct the events. Duval himself remained a phantom. No definitive record exists of his death. Some claimed he perished in the swamps outside New Orleans. Others suggest he left the country, living under a false name in Havana or New Orleans outskirts. One investigator, examining a ledger burned almost entirely by time, remarked, "Every note Duval wrote ends with a phrase about the body obeying a will other than its own. Perhaps he intended it for himself in the end." The full horror of his practice became evident not in isolated acts, but in the patterns. 56 known victims over a dozen years, all recorded with obsessive precision. Apprentices silenced before they could speak. Children and adults alike subjected to prolonged awareness of paralysis. Families unaware, grieving over the appearance of death while the mind was trapped in helplessness. Each act alone might have been dismissed as accident or misfortune. Together they revealed the systematic cruelty of a man whose intellect and social standing shielded him from suspicion. Those who attempted to confront the truth often suffered untimely deaths or disappeared from records. By the time authorities finally accessed the sealed documents, decades had passed. The residents of New Orleans had moved on. The city had endured war, yellow fever, hurricanes, and social upheaval. The house was repurposed, its dark legacy buried beneath layers of paint, mortar, and polite forgetfulness. Yet fragments of Duval's work persisted in archives, in oral tales, in the scratches within old coffins, and in the chemical traces of the cold room. Even today the house, or what remains of it, exerts a quiet dominion over memory. Streets built over its foundations whisper with faint echoes. Descendants of the families who once used the house of rest walk unknowingly above the cellar where conscious bodies endured prolonged paralysis. Scholars, when permitted to examine fragments, note the meticulous care in Duval's records, the precision of his methods, and the terrifying foresight in the creation of his system. Some secrets, historians have concluded, may never be fully revealed. The human capacity to forget, or to enforce forgetting, has shielded Duval from a complete reckoning. Yet the fragments endure, a testament to a man whose brilliance and cruelty intertwined, leaving behind a trail of evidence too fragmentary to fully comprehend, but too consistent to deny. The evidence found in 1901 remains chilling. Journals scratched with dates and formulas, coffins showing signs of struggle, and the unmistakable record of 56 individuals caught in a liminal state between life and death. What authorities found within the sealed chamber, and the systematic documentation Duval left behind remains a warning. Power, intellect, and social status can mask unimaginable cruelty. Respectable facades can conceal horror measured in hours of consciousness trapped in stillness. And some houses built in the name of mercy may shelter secrets that outlast generations. By the 1920s, the House of Rest had faded almost entirely from public memory. New Orleans had endured reconstruction, hurricanes, epidemics, and the slow hum of modernization. Yet beneath the veneer of streets and buildings, fragments of Duval's legacy persisted, hidden in the archives of city officials, in bricked-up basements, and in the whispered memories of old families. It was during this decade that an academic from Tulane University, Professor Henri Moreau, began to take interest in local mortuary practices, particularly the enigmatic accounts of extended viewings from mid-19th century obituaries. He discovered loose ledger pages in a locked drawer at the old City Hall, pages that had survived the fire of 1897, yellowed and damp with age. The entries contained chemical notations, minute measurements, and shorthand initials, ADEL, the same symbols appearing repeatedly across the 56 documented cases. Professor Moreau cross-referenced these names with cemetery records and parish death certificates. The pattern was undeniable. Bodies had been deliberately preserved in states of paralytic awareness. Several entries mentioned subtle movements, the faintest traces of respiration, and, chillingly, faint scratches along the inner coffins. The documentation left no doubt that these individuals had been conscious while appearing dead. Local archivists were hesitant to assist. Letters from descendants of the Duval family arrived, marked urgent, requesting that the documents remain sealed. Some threatened legal action, invoking old contracts and family privacy. Yet fragments were smuggled, photocopied, and quietly circulated among academics. Articles appeared in medical journals of the 1930s and 1940s, carefully phrased in abstract, cautious language. Anomalous post-mortem preservation observed in New Orleans, c. 1850s, they read. These reports hinted at the Declassified nature of Duval's experiments, but avoided naming him directly. Meanwhile, oral histories persisted in the neighborhoods surrounding Magazine Street. Elderly residents recalled stories told by their grandparents, children daring each other to peer into the abandoned house, servants avoiding the cellar, and a shadowy Undertaker whose presence lingered long after his disappearance. Some claimed that the ghosts of his victims could still be glimpsed in the windows at twilight, eyes fixed in frozen awareness, awaiting the final release they had never truly received. In the 1940s, a journalist named Lucien Fontaine uncovered fragments of Duval's journals in a dilapidated law office once owned by an associate of the Undertaker. He pieced together passages describing the paralytic compounds, the measured restraint of bodies, and the moral rationalizations Duval offered himself. Fontaine published a series of articles in a small local newspaper, emphasizing the historical significance rather than sensational horror. The public reacted with a mixture of disbelief and fascination, though the Duval name remained largely unspoken in polite conversation. By the 1950s, the site of the House of Rest had been repurposed multiple times. A warehouse, then a speakeasy, and finally a modest apartment complex. Renovations occasionally unearthed artifacts, a small vial marked for repose, fragments of ledger pages hidden in floorboards, and, most disturbingly, the impressions of restraints embedded in the cement floors of a sealed basement room. These finds were catalogued quietly and removed, often never to be publicly referenced. Historians now acknowledge that the pattern of Duval's crimes was systemic and intentional. 56 individuals over a dozen years were subjected to deliberate, conscious paralysis. Apprentices who witnessed the process were silenced, whether by chemical intervention or societal disbelief. The community, bound by social hierarchy, fear, and reverence for Duval's standing, remained largely complicit. Children were not spared. The same ledger pages show their initials marked alongside notes of rapid compliance and no outward distress, while subtle signs of consciousness, fingernail scratches, minute eye movements, were meticulously recorded. Even as the decades passed, the effects lingered in subtle ways. Families who had once sent their dead to Duval reported unexplained nervous ailments, faint recollections of voices, and an unshakable unease. Descendants, unaware of the full extent of their ancestors' interactions with the mourning house, would occasionally experience recurring dreams of confinement, of immobility while consciousness remained. Some scholars speculate that these psychological echoes were the inadvertent inheritance of those trapped hours of awareness, a transgenerational haunting encoded in memory and fear. In 1963, a preservationist attempting to restore the building discovered a hidden journal sewn into a floorboard. It contained Duval's own reflections, musings on life, death, and the illusion of mercy. In one passage he wrote, "The observer sees only the stillness, the soul within trembles. This is the art I have mastered, and the silence they leave behind is my triumph." The pages ended abruptly, leaving historians to wonder whether Duval perished in New Orleans, fled abroad, or simply vanished into obscurity with the Civil War as cover. Even now, the street that once bore the House of Rest carries whispers of its past. The apartment complex that stands atop the cellar is unmarked. The entrance to the hidden room remains sealed. Residents report occasional drafts, sudden cold spots, and faint tapping noises from below, often dismissed as plumbing or settling wood. Yet archival evidence, combined with survivor accounts and the meticulous records Duval left behind, demonstrates that some histories refuse to die quietly. The rediscovery of Duval's work has influenced modern forensic study. Scholars cite his techniques as early, though morally abhorrent, experiments in paralytic anesthesia and post-mortem preservation. They note the precision, the intelligence, and the horrific ethical violations that underpin them. The story of Duval is not one of lawless madness, but of deliberate cruelty masked by societal respectability, a reminder that intellect and social standing can shield malevolence, and that some secrets, even when uncovered, persist beyond full understanding. Today, descendants of the families who once sought Duval's services live in New Orleans neighborhoods, often unaware of the dark history beneath their streets. Archaeologists, historians, and forensic specialists who have investigated the site agree on one thing: the physical evidence, the journals, and the oral traditions collectively confirm the reality of the House of Rest. Yet gaps remain: 56 victims, 2 apprentices silenced, and a shadowy operator vanished into obscurity. Some of the details will never be recovered, no matter the diligence of research. Some secrets buried in New Orleans may never be fully revealed. The house itself has gone silent, but its history persists in whispers, in chemical traces, in scratch marks etched into wood and stone, and in the memories of those who dare to look too closely. The mourning house remains a testament to the human capacity for cruelty hidden beneath civility, a shadow that endures for generations, unbound by time, defying complete comprehension. What do you think of this story? Was everything truly revealed? Leave your thoughts below, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.